Hello, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan with another episode of my podcast, Cult Conversations, the Influence Continuum. I'm so honored to have Marietje Schaake with me. She is the International Policy Director at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center, International Policy Fellow at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence, and importantly, the author of The Tech Coup, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley, Princeton University Press. Oh my God, is this book prescient? And I'll just add that between 2009 and 2019, Marietje served as a member of the European Parliament for the Dutch Liberal Democratic Party, where she focused on trade, foreign affairs, and technology policies. And you write a monthly column for Financial Times and serve on the UN's AI advisory body. And you are an advisory board member with a number of nonprofits, including MERICS, MERICS, ECFR. We're going to put all of this in the blog. And I learned about your existence from my friend and colleague Dave Troy's podcast when he did an interview with you on Dave Troy Presents. And I'm like, oh my God, I want to see if she would grant me an interview. And I was surprised you did. So I'm very, very grateful. And since that interview, as of this morning, we're recording this February 17th, we're hearing Vance tell the Europeans that they should have more free speech, which means allow more radicalization online, in my opinion, by Musk, etc. We're seeing Trump send somebody to Russia and talking to Putin about Ukraine, and it's just a mess. And you have been following this lens for so many years. You're one of the top experts. So please share about the tech coup, and also please share what you think my listeners need to know about what's happening right now and the coup that's happening.
Well, thank you for your kind words. It's a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. Let's start where you ended, because I was in Munich where the vice president gave that speech and really, slapped Germans and everyone else who was present in the face with, an end of the transatlantic relation as we know it. And, a speech that was laced with conspiracy theory, references, strange examples of incidents across Europe to justify their support for the far right Alternative for Deutschland only a week before German elections. So, for obvious reasons, the Nazi past being one of them, the fact that this is very uncalled for interference in an election so shortly before elections, people were angry. And, of course, the whole Ukraine situation and the danger that Ukrainians face because of the U.S. stepping back and stepping into the direction of the Kremlin was even more pressing and will have deep consequences. But the combination of these two messages was more than an ice cold bucket onto the transatlantic alliance. I saw people crying. Senior politicians from both the US and the EU. It felt to a lot of people like a decisive moment, the way in which there was a speech by Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia in the past, that was also seen as a defining moment. And so between the US stepping away from the rules-based international order, the idea that there should be respect for human rights, international treaties, solidarity between like-minded nations, security guarantees in the context of NATO, all these pillars of how democratic societies have operated since World War II, is going to change the future of democracy for everybody. And at the same time, the fact that tech CEOs can have such a powerful position in forming these decisions, all in the name of efficiency, eroding the government of the United States, reforming it to be some kind of corporate shell, adds to this concern of, what is the US? at this moment in time. The fact that it's not an ally is one thing. I've heard people saying we should treat it as an adversarial power. But what is it going to mean for the people of the United States? Will those infamous checks and balances that we always learn about in American studies, will they be enough to
Right.
provide a countervailing power?
Right. And I just want to mention that CBS 60 Minutes last night had a segment on German policy about hate speech and how they're prosecuting people for saying hate speech and how important it is for the civil, respectful dialogue, the opposite of what I've been hearing from the Koch, fire entity, free speech, but don't talk about fossil fuels and how we're destroying our climate. Free speech, but don't talk about the tech oligarchy that wants to push their agenda of transhumanism, accelerationism, long-termism, and crypto, right? And so at least 60 Minutes is at least letting Americans who watch the show understand that the German people have a history with Hitler, and they understand the power of information and propaganda and its impact. So that was at least a plus. And then I want to say two more quick things. I interviewed Greg Epstein, who is the Harvard MIT humanist chaplain who wrote a book, Tech Agnostic. And I had the opportunity to interview him. And he talked about how big tech is the new world religion.
Mm-hmm.
People used to go around like this, and now they're going around like this. And how these tech bros are pushing this AI as God notion, and that governments shouldn't matter as much,
right,
and that the goal should be going to Mars. So I wanted to say that. And then lastly, when I was researching The Cult of Trump, which came out originally in 2019, all of my research showed that Trump had been recruited as an asset by the Soviet Union decades ago. So for me, and I interviewed Yuri Shvets, a former KGB official who emigrated to the United States when the Soviet Union fell. He said, "Oh, we recruited Trump decades ago," and gave details about it. So for me, the Russian influence, which the media has never really wanted to cover,
mm-hmm.
is becoming so much more transparent. So that's just quick response to, and we're crying a lot here too, seeing the devastation that's coming and has happened.
So it's really a very radical agenda, and I understand this whole debate about free speech from an American point of view, but I think it's a trap, because on the one hand, European countries have very far-reaching protection of freedom of expression. It's a little bit different than the First Amendment, but it's definitely, widely protected. The whole idea that speech is not protected in European countries is nonsense. It's nonsense.
I'm glad to
What we
hear you
have
say that.
differently, I think, in the EU is a wider view of different rights and freedoms that also matter. So, for example, non-discrimination, or for example, democratic rights and the integrity of elections. So it is not about saying speech should not be free. In fact, it's incredibly important, and I'm a big believer in freedom of expression. But
Right.
the question is around, what do business models of platforms like X or Facebook or YouTube do to algorithmically boost certain messages in a certain way that can cause outrage, or that actually, help spreading? Could be hateful, could be violent content, could be, child sexual exploitation materials, all kinds of things that are illegal. And so the idea that nothing should get in the way of any kind of expression is actually not how Americans think about it. They don't want to see pornography on their social media platforms. They don't want to see terrorist recruitment on their social media platforms, or at least I hope not. And so, I think we should really challenge some of these notions, and at the same time, We see Elon Musk suing civil society organizations that say things he doesn't like. We see executive orders that mean that books are not going to be widely available or banned from certain facilities. So, to anyone who believes in free speech, I would recommend look at what people do. Don't just listen to what they say when they invoke freedom of expression, because there's so much hypocrisy there and so much opportunistic use of the argument of free speech that I just think it really needs to be challenged.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And my understanding of the law here is that it's illegal to call fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire, because it does cause danger. And the way I look at it, if you're calling fire and there's no fire, you're lying. So the same principle about lies and disinformation and deliberate propaganda should be
Well, but what
applied.
it ultimately is about, of course, is that there's also public safety. And if you call fire in a
Right.
crowded theater or the equivalent thereof, then there may be a threat to public safety. But of course, we
Yes.
know that conventions and principles that were long the basis of American freedom and liberty are now revoked. So we have far-right militias that are being released from prison. We have a reframing of the storming of the Capitol, an attempt to violently overturn the outcome of elections, framed as a
Right.
day of love by the sitting U.S. president. Talk about the use of disinformation. And so we are
Right.
dealing with a completely new situation where the U.S. government is not even pretending to respect rules and principles the way the US has with all its ups and downs. I don't want to romanticize American democracy and American operations. We've seen so many low points, whether it be Guantanamo or weapons of mass destruction, and of course ongoing police violence, mistreatment of minorities, and so on. So I don't want to glorify anything that came before.
Right.
But there is a break with American tradition and American constitutionalism that is happening now that I think
Right.
is radical and will have enormous consequences in America, but also globally.
Right. And I'll just comment on your use of the word the American government and say I'd prefer we just frame it as the Trump, administration or the Trump cult. I haven't wrote a book the cult because he's asking for total loyalty. Like don't listen to your conscience. Don't think about facts. Don't think of even the best interest of your own
Mm-hmm.
constituents. Think of, be terrorized that will come after you if you don't do what we tell you to do. And I just read Dave Troy's piece in the Washington Spectator last week where he was saying our last big hope is that Republican congressmen and senators will start hearing from their constituents who had supported Trump but are losing their jobs, losing money from USAID, the farmers and other people, that we can, try to get a few of the Republican politicians to wake up and realize this is their family, this is their future, this is the world.
Well, let's see. I mean, of course, the Republican Party has been lacking a principled reading of what is going on, and the apparatus that supports Donald Trump has carefully helped to select loyalists in Congress as well. So I think
Right.
hope is always a good thing, but we'll have to really see dramatic stepping up by those members of Congress.
Right. So I don't want people just to tune out because it's so
Mm-hmm.
depressing, but it is cry worthy. But share with my listeners, because you've spent a long time studying AI and technology and Europe trying to encourage, ethical consideration for the public good. Could you share a bit about the hard work you've been
Well, I
doing?
think one of the interesting spaces to watch is AI safety, because remarkably, we heard all these AI experts, many Americans from the corporate world, from academia, warning that AI is a very dangerous technology. Some said it would lead to the end of humanity. Some said compared to the nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Others point to much more immediate threats like systemic discrimination or fostering disinformation or fraud. Lots of problems that this technology also causes. And people have called for regulation. But suddenly now, with this new administration, all those voices are remarkably quiet. We hear, Sam Altman of OpenAI saying that he thought the Biden administration was hostile towards business and that he's very happy, with the Trump administration. So in the field of governing AI, the US is stepping back as well, even though this is a global movement where there's not disagreement about the fact that this is technology with dangerous consequences. There may be discussion about what is the most urgent danger, is it short term or long term, but few experts will disagree that there are a lot of risks to mitigate. And it's
Right.
now shining a brighter spotlight on Europe to step up.
Right. So I'm almost finished with Suleiman's book, The Coming
Mm-hmm.
Wave, which I heard Bill Gates recommend. So I got it and I'm reading it. Of course, I listened to Jeffrey Hinton when he retired, and he explicitly said this could be used to start cults.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, as a cult expert,
Sure.
my ears opened up wide, and Harari as well, talking very articulately about it, how this is more than a tool.
It is.
This is
It is,
agent.
but also, the question of information integrity. What are people going to trust? How can they um, be very subtly steered in different directions? And this is interesting from the
Right.
perspective of competition. Do brands and products get the same treatment, fair treatment? And it's of course important from the perspective of disinformation, manipulation, self-determination, freedom of thought, access to information, all kinds of other core principles.
Right. I was interviewed by Tristan Harris and Asa Raskin for your Undivided podcasts a while
Mm-hmm.
back, talking about how being on social media is like being in a hypnotic state where you're doom scrolling, you're going into an altered state of consciousness where you're losing track of time, and that is a feature of hypnosis. It's one of the areas that I've studied extensively, and we're talking about my influence continuum that tries to explain ethical influences here. It's respect for informed consent and respect for
Right.
conscience and authentic self-agency versus the creating the radicalized pseudo-self that is believing the conspiracy theories or following the malignant narcissist cult
Mm-hmm.
leader, which is the stereotypical profile of dictators and cult leaders.
And what have you learned about
But
what can be done against such, manipulation of the mind and cults? So, in other words, what is your prescription of what needs to happen to break this kind of toxic online consumption and behavior?
Thank you for asking. So I have very definite opinions about this because I don't know if you know my story, but I was recruited at college into the Moonies cult in 1974. So I experienced a radicalization where I turned my back on my values, my family, my religion, and my country, and then got deprogrammed after a near fatal van crash. So how I see my whole 49 years full time of this is that real people, the authentic selves, do not like to be lied to, exploited, and treated like objects. They want to
Mm-hmm.
be loved, they want to be respected, they want trustworthy relationships. So for me, psychoeducation is the key. I've been saying for years there should be a public health emergency declared, that we have a mind control virus of
Mm-hmm.
authoritarian mind control. I hear Musk talking about the woke virus, but I've been
Right.
saying way before There's mind control viruses going on, mimetic warfare. And what I've learned over the decades is what's most effective to help people reality test is when family members and friends who know you, knew you before you got radicalized. And here's where the opposition has been doing things backwards, and from my perspective and expertise, is calling them names, saying they're stupid, they're idiots, they're morons, blocking them and muting them, because that pushes them deeper into the rabbit hole. So what works is to first learn yourself about the influence continuum. I have a scientifically validated model called the BITE model of authoritarian control that looks at behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And I say the more of these four overlapping variables applied to a pseudo identity, the more you can numerically say this is authoritarian control. So I've created a free anonymous survey with 40 questions. Anyone can go to bitemodel.com, answer honestly. No one will know what their answers are, and they can get an actual score, whether they're in a corporation that's acting unethically or not. But my main point is that I really believe former people from dictatorships who've come to the U.S., they know what it's like to live under authoritarian rule. They don't want this again. So in my view, they're ex-cult members of a political system, not a religious cult, but a political cult.
Right.
And there are tens of millions of people who've left religious cults here. And I talk in my book, The Cult of Trump, about these Christian nationalist, New Apostolic Reformation cults, where their leaders are claimed to be prophets or apostles, like Paula White, who is now designated in the White House, who supposedly speaks in tongues and said God said that Trump won the 2020 election. So but we have people leaving these groups, and my thought is educate them, mobilize them to share their stories. And what doesn't work ever is, if you're trying to help someone out of Scientology, don't criticize Hubbard or the group directly. Talk about other things that are mind control cults that the person will listen to. And what works best for MAGA folks is Chinese communist brainwashing. And we know that China has programs right now that they're applying to Muslims and Christians and others, and pimps and traffickers, since they made such a big deal about QAnon and how the Democrats are pedophiles and traffickers. I worked in this field helping sex trafficking survivors and labor trafficking survivors understand the mind control that was used on them to enslave them. So I'm calling for a messaging, psychoeducational campaign that meets people where they are. So if they got sucked in through a libertarian thing, work through that. If they're religious Christians who know Jesus and know the Bible, can be taught how to interact. But the key technique is asking a respectful question with genuine curiosity, learning to actively listen, wait for an answer, and do a follow-up question. Because when people come to their own realizations, they will change. I know I did. When I realized Moon was a liar, I was like, if he's a liar, then he's not the Messiah. If he's a liar, then he's not trustworthy. What have I been doing all these years?
But speaking of lies, what fascinates me so much is that there is a lot of lying coming from the top, from Trump and his followers. It seems that people know this, but they don't care. Or do you think they actually believe every word?
Well, I'd say that it depends. So, I'm also a forensic expert. So one would have to analyze case by case. But it seems like some people actually believe that Trump is ordained by God, like a King Cyrus figure. I've heard this out of Netanyahu's lips, as well as Mike Johnson's lips and other people like that. But a lot of people are in this us versus them, black and white, good
Right.
versus evil, everybody lies, notion, this nihilistic notion, or this we're in the last days, so God has magical mystery plans that's going to somehow recreate the earth, and we won't have global climate crises every single day. But the thing is for me, I was always raised honesty is the best policy.
Right.
So for me, that was very important to me, even though I was with Moon and he told me to lie to the members and as a leader and told me to lie. I was in a mind control state where I believed demons were going to possess me if I doubted or
Right.
allowed negative thoughts to come in. So the real me couldn't be like, but that's wrong. It was the cult me. So the issue is, when you're talking to somebody, who were they before they got radicalized? If they were a decent person where values mattered and honesty and integrity, and they weren't racist, you got to ask them questions that bring them back to remember who they are.
Right.
With family and friends, they can share photos or videos or memories of happy family events first, and then ask, is honesty important? Would you ever go into a business relationship with someone you knew was a liar and who was going to cheat you? They'd say, of course not. And then you say, again, without judgment, without trying to ram it down their throat, so help me step into your shoes. Walk me through how you have now come to a point where it seems acceptable to you,
But
what you're hearing.
do you think that this is now happening on a massive scale in the United States?
It's happening on a world scale. New
Right.
Apostolic Reformation has reportedly 900 million people worldwide in these authoritarian Bible cult groups. And here's what I'm wondering from you as an AI expert, because I'm very suspicious of AI, because my understanding is whatever can be created can be hacked and can be turned for bad purposes. But my fantasy was, is there a way that we can scale my expertise and my colleagues' expertises where people in many languages can learn about social psychology, where they can understand humans are not rational, we're emotional and social. To understand things like the Ash conformity study and the Milgram obedience study and the Zimbardo, the basic fundamentals of social psychology, and get people thinking to the future, like planetary survival for your children and your grandchildren, and reshift the frame. So I don't know.
I think
What do you think?
I understand that that's something that you would love to see, but I don't know what AI has to do with it necessarily. So, to scale the spreading of the information, you mean?
I mean, if I'm seeing these little avatar, even looking like human beings talking. So I'm wondering, and I've been talking to people in the AI world for a couple of years now at MIT, is there a way for a Steve Hassan to have, a avatar of me, but not just a chat bot, but like actually where my skills as a therapist could be incorporated, but it could be done in 200 languages, and we could train each one for each societies and whatever cults are well known.
I think that's theoretically possible for sure.
Yeah, that's my only thought of how to do this at scale. But it also seems to me like we're missing major platforms that are committed to integrity and journalistic.
Well, that's the problem, right?
Well,
a lot of what AI does is supported by the same old, what Shoshana Zuboff called surveillance capitalism driven platforms, where the algorithmic amplification is not transparent.
Right.
So, all users of X have seen a difference since Elon Musk took over.
Right.
Some may be happy about it, some may be very sad about it, but it's undeniably a different place.
Yeah.
That is because he fired trust and safety teams, but it's presumably also because of how he changed the algorithm.
Right.
But we just don't know exactly how that works. And so what's interesting to watch is that in the EU, we have a recent law that talks about the obligations that tech companies have to moderate content, but also to prevent systemic risks, for example, to democracy.
Right.
And so the European Commission has now asked for data retention in two cases, one involving X, the other involving TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
And so hopefully from that data that will then be looked at, we can learn more about algorithmic amplification. Because I think, again, going back to the speech trap, a lot of it is not so much about what is being said, because people are allowed to say all kinds of stuff.
Right.
It's about how it's amplified to have bigger impact, to be more divisive, to reach vulnerable people, on the basis of data profiling, which is another very
Huge.
important thing.
Yeah.
How much we know, like how much companies know about us more than we know about ourselves, and how that very minute data can be used to our weaknesses, whether it is to offer a sale at a moment where, the company knows from our data profile that we're more vulnerable to purchasing something.
Right.
Or whether it's an idea that we are then more likely to believe, or an emotion, as you said. And so I think the need for more transparency to understand how this algorithmic amplification works and what we can do about it is key.
Right.
And we will probably get some more of that from the EU. But of course, the fact that the EU has these laws also explains why Elon Musk is so keen to undermine the European Union.
Exactly.
And so I think it's really important to
and
connect
Zuckerberg.
those dots. It's not Zuckerberg now too. I mean, we heard Joel Kaplan in Munich saying that he wants to, call the president if he feels like Facebook is being discriminated, mistreated by the EU. Whereas, of course, there is due process in the EU. Companies can go and challenge court decisions like an antitrust fine. The whole idea that they are just randomly treated and subject to fines is nonsense.
Right. So I've been hearing a lot of people just like fed up with billionaires and trying to lump them all as evil, because who needs $1 billion? No one can ever spend that much money. But I'm opposed to that kind of lumping in, because I think there are hundreds of billionaires who aren't Musk and Thiel and Zuckerberg, but they need to see, a path where they're the good people caring about the future of the earth, and because there can be resources put to developing platforms, social media platforms and media outlets, and people would get off of X, if they felt like there was something that was viable.
Well, there are viable alternatives now. I think Blue Sky is a very interesting place right now. So, to
I'm
any
on
of your
Blue
listeners,
Sky, but I don't have 70,000 followers like I have on X. I lost 10,000 and 7,000. I started that, but I will say that Dave Troy said, Andreessen and Horowitz are major funders of Blue Sky, Steve. I wouldn't spend too much time and energy developing Blue Sky. And I was like, yikes.
Well,
I think maybe he said that was about Substack, actually, which I'm on also.
There's also Mastodon.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's generally good to, vote with the feet, to go elsewhere. But also I've been thinking a lot about, should I leave X or not? And then a lot of people said, if we leave the space entirely, to the like-minded, voices, then that would also be a surrender. So for the moment, I'm still there, but it's much less of a pleasant place, and I see much less interesting content for me.
I'm there too.
I see a lot of, toxic masculinity, a lot of far right content, a lot of polarizing content.
Right.
And a lot of the same voices, whereas it used to be a place where I could see much more variety, many more, for example, journalists that were on the ground where something was happening,
Right.
much more relevant from my point of view. But
Right.
I think what we need to push towards, and I think it would really also help you study some of the effects that you're interested in, citizens understand better, in what world they're living, if we
Yes.
had more transparency into these business models. And
Right.
it's not about being against billionaires per se, although I do think that the whole idea that people who have mainly spent their lives making extraordinary amounts of money are now the defenders of the average American is, ironic at least. And I'm surprised that people fall for it. But I think that economic success is still seen as something very significant by many Americans.
Mm.
Maybe more than, ethical behavior or, a sense of service, for example, to the
Right.
community. And
Yeah.
so I think that that's unfortunate. And collectively, too, we have for too long made the case for democracy based on an economic success
Right.
story. And of course, democracy is much more than the fact that people are wealthier or, that
Right.
open market economies render better living conditions for people. And because it's been argued from an economic perspective, I think that has made support for democracy more vulnerable in the end.
Yeah. And what I learned in researching the cult of Trump is it's been a 50-year project, very intentional project of right-wing extremists and libertarians and Christian nationalists to systematically dismantle our checks and balances. And Opus Dei is one of the major forces behind the Supreme Court takeover, as
Mm-hmm.
well as the Heritage Foundation Project 2025, is Opus Dei, which is being sued for trafficking by
I had no
recruiting
idea that that was
underage
so
girls.
important in the US.
Very important. It's global, and
Yes,
the
no, I
Pope
know that, but
and the Pope has taken steps to limit their power within the Catholic Church, but they think he's satanic because he speaks for
right,
Jesus and immigrants and poor people. But
right.
they're hugely powerful. I interviewed a UK journalist named Gareth Gore, who wrote a fantastic book on Opus Dei that I highly recommend. And I just watched a 4-part docuseries online about women who were literally recruited, uh, 12, 13, 14 years of age. Just don't tell your parents. And they were trafficked for
Yeah,
20,
I've
30
seen that.
years.
And working as slaves, essentially, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
it's
this is,
awful.
and I'll just say what I use in my professional counseling with people in religious cults is, especially if Jewish cults, Christian cults, or Muslim cults, they all share a version of the Garden of Eden story. And I argue, if you believe in God, and Almighty God could have brainwashed Adam and Eve to be dependent and obedient, but God wanted faith and wanted choice. And so, doesn't that say something? And now, do you believe God changed his mind or her mind, its
Mm,
mind, and said, yeah, it's okay to lie and coerce people to enslave them? It's,
right.
but it turns
Fascinating.
on light bulbs for some people.
Fascinating. So interesting to have all that expertise that you have projected onto this American political moment. And I hope you can really help people see the dynamics of manipulation.
I'm just, a therapist in Massachusetts without the funding and the reach, but I've been doing this work and trying to get the word out, and I'm so grateful to people like yourself who have the connections at major institutions, whether it's Parliament in Europe or Stanford. Um, that we need to share our knowledge and experiences. And I don't know. I was
Well,
saying,
my focus, yeah, so
no, I was
go
just
ahead,
going to
sorry.
say, I was saying years ago, we need a Manhattan style project of like getting a lot of brilliant people in a room saying, what
Right,
are we going to do? What's a workable plan? We can't keep reacting to each of these
right.
flooding, crazy things that are happening. We need a 50-year plan of how we're going to keep the planet going.
Well, yeah, that's another place where the US is stepping back.
Yes.
So my focus is much more on, how to protect the public interest against privatized takeover, conflict of interest, which I think is really rampant now in the United States with Elon Musk remaking the government that he has so many contracts with that have oversight roles over his companies that he can now, adjust.
Right.
So I'm trying to look much more at policy, politics, understanding how the relationship between private power and public interest should work. And my conclusion is that the tech sector has become too powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And so was Greg Epstein's book, Tech Agnostic, about it becoming a religion where people,
Right.
think the future is worshiping big tech and, having startups is the goal of
Right.
your
Yeah, and
career.
that tech can solve everything, like techno utopianism. So the idea that every problem can be solved with technology.
Right. And what I'm seeing, people are depressed, they're anxious, they're not sleeping properly, and there are too many hours online instead of like being with real people, hugging them, dancing, listening to music, playing with their dogs or cats, or,
Right.
being in nature. Because we're humans, we're not androids.
No, of course, I agree with you. I think it's, the anxiety of young people, the addictive nature of a lot of the social media
Mm-hmm.
platforms, what it does to our concentration. I think the word of the year last year was brain rot.
I read about that as well. And,
That's very sad.
I grew up reading physical books.
Right.
I had to
You
get
have some behind you.
I have I had to give I just moved and I had to give away thousands of my books, but I just love holding books and reading books.
Yeah, I understand.
And I love to learn. And when people say, "What do I tell my kids?" I say, "Develop a love of learning, develop a curiosity, and encourage them to develop skills and be
Hmm.
prepared to pivot, whatever their."
But I think these are very uncertain times for a lot of people, including students. I mean, I
Yeah,
see that at Stanford as well, where, people who thought they could have a great future as computer scientists are now wondering, will generative AI take over and stuff like that?
right.
So I think adjustability and, more EQ than IQ
Yeah,
is incredibly important these days. And giving people much more of that sort of social support.
right.
Because I also see a lot of loneliness, especially on the part of people who work very hard in university.
Mm-hmm.
Their future is uncertain.
Right.
And, maybe you know this, but I've heard that there is a relationship between people feeling uncertain about, their economic future, the future of the climate and the earth, about, I don't know, now with the Trump administration, immigrants being thrown out of the country, many things to be uncertain about,
Right.
rapid technological change, that also drives them into the hands of what they perceive as strong leaders.
This is true. Like we know this historically, and all of the models of brainwashing. If you want to brainwash someone, you overload them. You do what's called unfreeze by confusing, by giving contradictory information, etc. and
Mm-hmm.
and people, I mean, I grew up, there was, you were talking earlier about the American dream. You get a career, you get a house, you get married, you have kids, etc. And now
Right.
people are like, what's the future going to be like, as we're seeing these horrible earthquakes and fires and floods, etc., with all of the fossil fuel.
Yeah.
I know you have a child, and I promise to keep this shorter. So I would like to just offer you last words. Especially if there are uh, things we should follow. Of course, I want people to get your book, The Tech Coup: How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley, Princeton University Press.
For a lot of people, the outsized power of tech companies has only become very clear because of the role that Elon Musk plays. But
Mm-hmm.
in the book, I lay out how it's also a phenomenon that is more invisible, that is systemic, and that manifests itself in many more ways. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it would be a mistake to think about the capture of our institutions, the threat to democracy by these tech companies only through Elon Musk. So even if
Right.
Elon Musk were to leave the scene, tomorrow, there would still be a problem with capture and the outsized power of tech companies. So
Right.
maybe that's just the one thing I want to leave listeners with. And of course, thank you. I hope that they will read the book. But it's a much deeper and more intertwined problem than just individual billionaires, to come back to their
Right.
role.
Right. So I just want to thank you for making time to speak with my audience. And Marietje Schaake, International Policy Director at Stanford University Cyber Policy Center, International Policy Fellow at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI, and the author of this fine book. And let's stay in touch. Let's try to solve the dilemmas that are facing us now.
Oh yes, we must work together. Thank you so much for having me.
Have hope, and thank you again. Steve Hassan here. You know, it's been decades since my family rescued me from the Moonies. I've been at this for over 47 years. The need has never been greater. If you're able, please consider hitting the super thanks button below, and it'll help us to do better. Every penny will help us toward our goal of educating the planet about undue influence. Remember, it's your mind, only you should control it.